Today's episode of Curiosity Daily is sponsored by Discover.
Want to hear something amazing? Discover matches all the cash back you earn on your credit card at the end of your first year, automatically, with no limit on how much you can earn.
And what's even more amazing is that Discover is accepted at 99% of places in the U.S. that take credit cards. So when it comes to Discover, get used to hearing yes more often.
Learn more at discover.com/yes. 2021 Nielsen Report. Limitations apply.
Hi, you're about to get smarter in just a few minutes with Curiosity Daily from Curiosity.com. I'm Cody Goff.
And I'm Ashley Hamer. Today, you learn about why most conversations go on for twice as long as we want them to. And we have no idea when the other person wants the conversation to end. Before you start spiraling out about how many times you've held people hostage in conversation, let's look at the research. To get a sense of how conversations work, a team of psychology researchers recruited 932 people to take part in 2 experiments. In the first, participants thought back on a recent conversation they had. In the second, the researchers paired people up with strangers. The pairs talked about whatever they wanted for as long as they wanted. Then, after both experiments, the participants had this as another reason to cut those Zoom calls even shorter.
That's a pretty good story. It's really relatable.
Yeah, it's pretty relatable. I agree.
Yeah, I like that we ran it. I think it was a good idea to talk about it.
Yeah, I like running things like that.
Very interesting science.
Definitely. It's very interesting.
I'm glad scientists are working on this kind of thing, aren't you?
Cody, stop it! I can't handle it.
You know how some people are better than others at handling the cold? Well, part of that might be thanks to a genetic mutation that about 1.5 billion of us humans are carrying in our genomes right this very second. The gene in question is called ACTN3, and its job aimed to enable explosive power like sprinting or powerlifting. Now, most people's DNA contains a variant of ACTN3 that works just fine, but about 20% of the global population has a different form of the gene. This form is called the loss of function variant. And as you can probably tell by the name, it doesn't help the body produce alpha-actinin 3. People with that variant usually have more slow twitch muscle fibers, which aren't as powerful as the fast twitch kind. These are more associated with endurance activities like long distance running. Men to sit in cold water for 2 hours. And why? Just to mess with them. Ha! Just kidding. They did it to test the hypothesis that loss of function in the ACTN3 gene can offer an advantage by improving cold tolerance. The researchers took blood samples from the volunteers to figure out who had functioning and non-functioning versions of ACTN3. And then they had each participant get up to his neck in cold water for 20 minutes. I hope they were paid for that. Then they got out for 10 minutes. And then they did the whole thing again. And that went on for nearly 3 hours, or until their body temperature fell below about 96 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 36 degrees Celsius. And the results were pretty interesting. Only 30% of the volunteers who had a functional version of the gene were able to keep their body temperature above 96 degrees for the entire experiment. But 69% of the men with the non-functional gene variant managed to stick it out the entire time. So why would less powerful muscle fibers lead to better cold tolerance? Because they don't waste as much energy through shivering. The fast twitch muscle fibers in people with a functioning ACTN3 gene can generate heat quickly but tire out easily. The slow twitch muscle fibers associated with the non-functioning gene keep those people warm through extended, low-intensity muscle activation. It's a more efficient way to stay warm. And this just goes to show that evolution doesn't just take one path. There are
Plans, a show all about change.
Behavioral scientist Dr. Maya Shankar asks the question, what exactly happens when we find ourselves at the brink of change? The show features incredible stories from Tiffany Haddish, Hillary Clinton, Casey Musgraves,
And little-known guests, too, like a young cancer researcher in the throes of a stage 4 diagnosis, and a black jazz musician who convinced KKK members to leave the Klan. You'll come away thinking a bit differently about change in your own life.
Listen to A Slight Change of Plans wherever you get your podcasts. If there's one thing humans have done for thousands of years, it's learn from their elders. We put our heads together and expand on what our ancestors have already learned in order to make new advances with each generation. Well, researchers from Oxford University shows that we're not the only ones. It turns out that homing pigeons pass down knowledge too, and that knowledge makes them better navigators. The researchers behind the 2017 study started by sending 10 pigeons on specific flight routes. Once the pigeons learned where to fly, the researchers gave each one a partner. Then they started continually switching out one pigeon at a time from the pairs, the way it might be if new generations of pigeons joined the group. Then they had these new pairs continue on the same routes. The hope was that each individual pigeon could pass its experience of the route on to the newcomer, who would pass its knowledge to the next newcomer. That way, the collective intelligence of the group could gradually make the original route more efficient. The pigeons may not have as much brain power as humans or other primates, but they still were able to improve their navigational abilities over time. The groups that were switched out to simulate new generations eventually flew more direct routes than the pairs with the same members or than single birds. The key discovery here is that the gradual improvement wasn't thanks to new ideas coming from individual birds, but instead from a form of collective intelligence that grew from pairs of birds having to solve the problem together. That's huge, since scientists once thought that humans were the only ones with the brain power to accumulate collective knowledge as a society. But if pigeons can do it, what other species can? Scientists will just have to observe other animals to see if they also work together over time to make improvements. After all, why wouldn't they? The wisdom of the ages is some pretty valuable stuff.
Let's recap what we learned today to wrap up. Starting with the fact that a study with nearly 1,000 participants found that most conversations go on for twice as long as we want them to. Researchers say this is a classic coordination problem because we hide our boredom for social reasons. Like, for example, we don't want to seem rude. Next time you're super bored with a conversation, you can keep this in mind because maybe the other person is ready to move on too.
But also, I feel like if this is such a common I don't think there's any judgment there. So don't worry about it. And we learned that around 20% of people have a genetic mutation that makes them resilient to the cold. It all comes down to a gene called ACTN3. In most people, the functioning gene helps fast twitch muscle fibers generate heat through shivering, but they tire out more easily. People with the non-functioning gene have more slow twitch muscle fibers that keep them warm through extended low-intensity muscle activation. It's working smarter, not harder.
And maybe we should mention that like a person might have a more natural predisposition towards faster slow twitch muscle fibers, but they can train the other one, right?
Yeah, there have been studies of identical twins where I believe this specific study, one of the twins became a truck driver and the other one became an endurance athlete. And the truck driver had a lot more fast twitch muscle fibers, but the endurance athlete, because of all the endurance he was doing, had a lot more slow twitch muscle fibers. So you can change those things. I don't know how that translates into the ACTN3 gene, though. Probably that is the way it is for the rest of your life. But who knows?
Yeah. And we also learned that homing pigeons can pass their knowledge to each other. Researchers demonstrated that they have collective knowledge, which we used to think only humans had. Don't count pigeons short.
I love the idea of pigeons teaching each other how to get where they're going. You're like, oh yeah, come along. This is the way to the breeding ground. There's a target on the way. You could stop, get a drink.
Today's stories were written by Kelsey Donk, Grant Curran, and Haley Ottman, and edited by Ashley Hamer, who's the managing editor for Curiosity Daily.
Script writing was by Cody Goff and Sonia Hodgen. Today's episode was produced and edited by Cody Goff.
You know, Ashley, did you know my birthday was yesterday?
Was it really? Of course I knew that.